Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a new video series on the channel called Deck Building Deep Dive, where I go really in depth on one particular archetype and break down a bunch of different builds of that archetype that I've been working on, talking about the different strengths and weaknesses and different ways that you can build the deck. So the genesis of this video series basically came from when I came back from my little break earlier this week. I basically been playing Mono Green Devotion in Historic non-stop. I played hundreds of matches with Devotion, managed to climb, out of the hundreds back into top 10 Mythic. The deck is definitely really strong since the addition of Utopia Sprawl, and so I've been working on a ton of different builds of it, and I'm still at the point now where I'm really not sure which build is optimal. I'm going to be showing off 6 different versions of the deck that I all think have their right place in the meta, but it just really depends on what the other decks in the format are doing. Some decks are better positioned in the mirror, some decks are better positioned against the typically worst matchups, some decks are just, generically well positioned. So what I'm going to do in this video is basically start off by showing you kind of a stock version of the deck and explain how the deck works for people who aren't familiar, and then I'm going to show you the 6 different builds I've been working on, talking about the differences between them, some of the deck building issues and why I've gone for certain choices over others, and at the end I've got 3 matches with 3 different builds so you can see them in action as well. So starting off, I'm just going to be showing you kind of my approximation of what I consider to be a stock list or a generic devotion list. Now I definitely don't think this is the optimal build at all, which is why I've been working on different variants of it, but I thought it would be useful just to show you this list to start off with, to explain the deck for people who aren't familiar with it, and then also to highlight the differences between the builds that I've been working on compared to this. So Mono Green Devotion, very quickly, if you're not familiar with it, is basically a ramp deck that is largely built around Kiora, Behemoth, Beckoner, Karn, and Nykthos. So Nykthos is kind of the centerpiece of the deck that really enables the powerful broken stuff that this deck is doing. So as you can see, the mana costs, we have a ton of green pips. We got stuff like Old Growth Troll and Pelucranos that have triple green. Same with Cavalier of Thorns, and all of our early stuff puts green pips on the battlefield. So once we have a bunch of Devotion, we can activate Nykthos to produce a ton of mana, which then enables us to cast stuff like Storm the Festival, Cavalier of Thorns, fetch our finishes out of the sideboard with Karn the Great Creator, stuff like Portal to Phyrexia, Cityscape Leveler, Kramer's Memorial, and then we also have Kiora, Behemoth, Beckoner that draws us cards when we play our big creatures like Old Growth Troll, Pelucranos, and Cavalier of Thorns, but more importantly can untap Nykthos to produce these crazy turns where we can just storm off, produce 40, 50, sometimes even upwards of that mana in one turn, keep looping Storm the Festivals, get Karns into play, get stuff out the sideboard, and just win. So basically the general idea of this deck is that it's pure ramp in the early game. As you see, we don't have any interaction because you are a mono green deck. Green doesn't have great interaction, so you want to ramp to get ahead, get creatures in play to block, the opponent's aggressive starts, then get Karn or Kiora online, and then start picking stuff out the sideboard, either to interact with the opponent or close the game out. So the main reason why I've come back to this deck is Utopia Sprawl. So Devotion in general, I think, is in a pretty rough position ever since Orcish Bowmasters got added to the format. I think pre-Lord of the Rings, Devotion was in a reasonable spot. With the addition of Orcish Bowmasters, I think the deck took a real hit, because before Utopia Sprawl was added, you were really relying on the 1 toughness mana dorks like Llanowar Elves, for example, that I'll bring up in case you're not familiar with it. So Llanowar Elves, this is kind of the bread and butter of the old Devotion decks. You would have to run stuff like this, an Elvish Mystic, or sometimes Avacyn's Pilgrim, and having your mana dorks die to Orcish Bowmasters was an absolute disaster. Not to mention the fact that with the addition of the One Ring, the mid-range decks had a stronger late game as well, and so in general I just think Lord of the Rings, mainly because of Bowmasters, was really punishing for Devotion, so the deck kind of fell off at that point. But Utopia Sprawl is such a big addition to the deck because it's just everything the deck wants. So first of all, it's a non-creature 1 mana ramp. A 1 mana ramp in Devotion is so big. You want as much 1 mana ramp as possible. And Utopia Sprawl being an enchantment rather than a creature is so huge, because typically the way that interactive decks would beat Devotion is they would typically have stuff like Fatal Push or just creature removal in the early game to kill the Llanowar Elves and the Elvish Mystics, and then or the Delighted Halflings. And then the Devotion deck was kind of left in a tough spot where if they didn't have much other ramp, they're kind of just stranded with a bunch of expensive cards in their hands. They were basically just left at the mercy of the top of their deck. Whereas now, with Utopia Sprawl being the premier 1 mana ramp interaction, the premier 1 mana ramp option, creature removal doesn't really work against you anymore, right? So the Fatal Push decks are left in a real conundrum where they can mulligan to a Fatal Push, but if you have a Utopia Sprawl, they just can't interact with that. Then on top of that, Utopia Sprawl basically pays for itself automatically if you have put it on an untapped land. So if you have 2 forests, tap 1 to put Utopia Sprawl on the other one, and then you still have 2 mana. So it's essentially free if you play it like that. It also pairs really, really nicely with Kiora as well, because you can do stuff like turn 1 Utopia Sprawl, turn 2 Kiora, untap the land with Utopia Sprawl on it, and play a 2-drop as well, which is a really, really explosive start. And you can obviously stack them up on the same land as well, so you can have really, really explosive starts with multiple Utopia Sprawls as well. So this is such a big upgrade to the deck, and honestly, if you could run more than 4 of a card, I would be running somewhere between 12 and 14 Utopia Sprawls in my deck. This is just by far and away the best ramp option, and honestly, this has just completely flipped the whole viability of the devotion decks. As I mentioned, because the interactive decks have such a hard time picking apart your early ramp now, because you're not completely reliant on the mana dorks. So the awkward thing about that is, outside of that, you have to rely on some other options. You know, as I said, if I could, I would just run 12 or 14 Utopia Sprawls. Obviously, we can only run 4, so we do need to run some other stuff. Delighted Halfling is definitely the 1 mana dork of choice over stuff like Llanowar Elves or Elvish Mystic, purely because it's got 2 toughness, so it doesn't die to Bowmasters. Bowmasters is still such a big part of the format, so you know, Delighted Halfling is definitely the card to be running over Llanowar Elves and Elvish Mystic. However, that does have some impact on the rest of the deck, mainly Old Growth Troll. So I'm really not a big fan of this card in Devotion right now, purely because of Delighted Halfling. So Halfling only taps for colourless or a colour if it's a legendary spell. So it works with stuff like Pelucranos fine, because you can go Halfling on turn 1 into Pelucranos on turn 2. But because Halfling is such an integral, you know, it's the only really good other 1 mana ramp that Devotion has access to right now, I'm really not a big fan of Old Growth Troll anymore, because starts with Halfling into Troll are really awkward. But we have a bunch of other options to run instead of Old Growth Troll that I'll get to a little bit later. But Halfling definitely the next best ramp option. Then Wolflow Haven, another really important option, has a lot of the same strengths as the Utopia Sprawl. Because it's an enchantment, it's much harder to interact with. Since we have 4 enchantments now, Kiora becomes a lot better as well, because we can load up a bunch of enchantments on 1 land and then untap that land with Kiora to kind of simulate what Nykthos would be doing later in the game. And then we've obviously got like Cavalier of Thorns, which is very good at finding the Nykthos, which is the key card in the deck, whilst also milling over Storm the Festival, which gives us more gas to play later in the game. And then Khan is obviously very flexible, helping find our sideboard cards. Then, as I mentioned, you know, these cards are basically the flex slots in the deck. Invasion of Ixalan is just here because I'm running a lot of creatures, but as we get to the other builds, I'll show you what I'm running instead. So in terms of the wish boards, so these are basically all one-offs that we can fetch with Khan. So I'm going to go through these and explain what they're here for, and then as I get to the builds later in the video, if I deviate from this setup in any way, I'll explain why as I get to those builds individually. So I'm going to quickly go through these. Tormod's Crypt is basically fetchable graveyard hate. It being 0 mana is really nice because it means that we can play at the same turn that we play Khan, even if we have no other mana available, which is really nice. So this is good against decks like Dredge and Reanimator, but there are just a decent number of spots where if the opponent has a graveyard interaction that you want to shut off, you can just fetch this. Then we've got Haywire Might, which is just an out to any non-creature artifact or enchantment that also gains you 3 life, so just fetchable if you need to kill something, and is also just another card that you can get to protect Khan. You know, if you just need another blocker in play, you can Khan, grab a Haywire Might, block with it, and you gain 3 life, which is very nice against aggro. Then we've got Pithing Needle, which is incredibly well positioned right now because it's good at shutting off Kethis combo, Yawgmoth combo, Samwise combo, the One Ring. It can shut off Maze's End against gates. Sometimes you want to fetch it in the mirror if the opponent has like a Kiora and they're going to untap a bunch of mana. So yeah, Pithing Needle's super well positioned right now, very useful to have access to. Then Shadow Spear giving trample and lifelink is first of all very nice against decks that have a lot of good reach. So if you're up against a deck running burn spells or a sacrifice deck with Goblin Bombardment, having Shadow Spear as a way to just gain life to ensure that you don't just get burnt out is really nice. And then it also pairs really nicely with your big creatures, especially Lair of the Hydra. If you have a ton of mana off Nykthos, you can just pump all that mana into Lair of the Hydra, then just fetch Shadow Spear, equip it to the Lair, and then just attack for lethal, which is a nice line. Then we got Stonebrain, which is just a very nice card against combo decks. So again, very nice against Yawgmoth and Kethis to take their namesake card. Also does have some applications in other matchups, like if you're against Creativity or Charbelcher, you can take stuff out there as well. And also has other applications, like it can be used off the Pestilent Cauldron combo. Speaking of which, Pestilent Cauldron is here to give you a combo win. I'm not going to explain how this combo works because it just takes too long and is quite complicated without visualizing it. But if you Google Mono Green Devotion Pestilent Cauldron combo, it'll explain how it works. Honestly, I very rarely go for this, but I think it's worth having access to because the matches... Well, if you have room for it, I think it's worth having access to. But basically, this just gives you a way to combo win. And you can also just use Restorative Burst for value if you have stuff in your graveyard you want to get back as well. Then we've got Khan Silex, which isn't a card that everyone runs, but if you have space for it, is very useful against go wide decks. If the opponent does go wide very quickly, you can use Silex to just wipe their board. You can also untap it with Cura to activate it the turn you play it, which is pretty nice. And to be honest, one of the big weaknesses of Devotion is you don't have good interaction in the early game, so you typically are quite weak to go wide decks. So Karn's Silex is a nice way to mitigate that. Then we've got the One Ring, which is just one of the best generically good cards in the format. So if you're in a position where you don't have much going on and your Karn isn't under immediate pressure, you can just fetch the One Ring and start gaining a bunch of card advantage that just runs away with the game. So this is just a generically good card to fetch. Then we've got Sky Sovereign, which is really good against creatures or, Planeswalkers. This can kill as well, but just very good if the opponent is playing a creature deck. You can fetch Sky Sovereign, kill one of their creatures, and then you can just keep crewing it every turn to kill something and apply pressure. Might Stone and Weak Stone is mainly just here as a way to kill Shieldred. Shieldred One Ring decks are everywhere right now still, and having this as a fetchable way to cleanly kill Shieldred, as opposed to something like Transmogrifying Wand, which is kind of contending for the same spot. And then it also stays in the battlefield to produce mana to allow you to cast your other artifacts. So if you go Might Stone and Weak Stone, you can then fetch something like a Cityscape level or Portal to Phyrexia, and you can ramp into that off the Might Stone. So mainly just here as a way to kill Shieldred though. And we've got a Chroma's Memorial, which is a really nice finisher in the deck. Gives you a bunch of keywords, but the most important ones are Flying and Haste, just as a way to close games out. So a lot of the decks, or a lot of the other builds I'm going to be showing you later, are very good at swarming the battlefield very quickly. And then if you just go Karn, Chroma's Memorial, you can just play that and then just attack for lethal out of nowhere with a big hasty flying attack. Then we've got Cityscape Leveler, which is one of the most important wishboard targets because it's a really generically powerful card that kills any permanent on cast. So even if it's countered, you get to kill whatever you need to. When it comes down, it triggers Cure as well, so you draw an extra card. Even if it gets killed, it has Unearth, so you can get another activation off it. So Cityscape Leveler, really good snowbally threat that can win the game, and also just deal with any permanent. Then we've got Portal to Phyrexia, which is another generically powerful top-end card. If the opponent has multiple creatures in play and Cityscape Leveler isn't going to get the job done, you can just Portal, force the opponent to sacrifice stuff, and then, the effect of being able to reanimate stuff is just going to run away with the game in your favour as well. Also very nice against creatures that are otherwise hard to kill, so stuff like Ulamog against Gates or Serra's Emissary, if the opponent's playing that, this gets around that as well. Then we've got Woodcaller Automaton, which is a really nice way to untap Nykthos. So you can go Karn, play the Woodcaller Automaton for 4 mana, untap the Nykthos, and then you've also got 2 extra green pips of Devotion because of the Automaton as well. So this is just kind of a combo extender. And then finally we've got Treasure Vault as a land. So having a fetchable land off Karn is very important for situations where you have expensive cards in your hand and you're missing land drops. And the reason I've gone for Treasure Vault over Darksteel Citadel in this particular version is because if you're running Pestilent Cauldron, you should be running Treasure Vault over Darksteel Citadel because it's a way that you can produce black mana to hardcast the Pestilent Cauldron to go for the combo. However, if you're not running Cauldron, which some of the builds I'm going to show aren't, it's definitely worth running Darksteel Citadel instead because the Indestructible is relevant against, generic artifact removal. So in terms of the matchup spreads for Devotion, which I think is very important to mention because a lot of the builds I'm going to be showing do go out of their way to try and improve some of the more difficult matchups, but in a very simplistic sense, Mono Green Devotion is typically weakest against decks that demand early interaction because your early game is all about ramping. If you look, we don't have any interaction until we get a Karn in play and then we can start pulling stuff out the sideboard. So decks like Wizards and Auras and Ninjas that demand they're very weak against decks like Rakdos Midrange that have a lot of early interaction. Those are typically the best decks against Devotion because your early game doesn't have any way to slow down what the opponent's doing, and they typically goldfish a lot quicker than you. And then on top of that, you can also be weak to fast combo decks that Karn isn't that effective at shutting off. So I think Yawgmoth is a reasonable example of that. Obviously, Karn can grab Pithing Needle, but Yawgmoth can be a tricky matchup because you're not always going to have Karn to shut that off. And so, that's definitely a matchup that I'm looking to improve in basically all of the builds that I'm playing because that is one of the most powerful and popular decks right now. And there are a number of other combo decks that Karn just completely hoses, like Kethis combo gets really badly hurt by Karn because it shuts off all their Mox Ambers and Relic of Legends and stuff. And then, stuff like Goblin Charbelcher also really struggles to beat Karn as well. So typically the bad matchups for Devotion are fast aggressive decks that demand interaction and combo decks that are resilient against Karn. And you're good against basically everything else, right? Your mid to late game is so strong. You have such good flexibility out the sideboard that you basically just go over the top of everything else. So what I'm going to do next is basically just break down all of the 6 different builds. And then, like I said, I've got some gameplay at the end of 3 of the different decks so you guys can see it in action. Definitely let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this sort of video and you'd like me to do it in future. And let's just get straight into the first build. So this is the very first build that I wanted to highlight. And it's one of the first builds that I tried. And it's largely built around this new card from the latest set, Blossoming Tortoise. So I went 14-4 with this build, which is a reasonable record. I'm not actually that high on this particular version, but I wanted to highlight it just because I wanted to talk about Blossoming Tortoise, because it is a really interesting card, and I want to talk about where I think it could slot in Devotion in future. So 4 mana 3/3, when it ETBs or attacks, you mill 3 and then return a land from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Activated abilities of lands you control cost 1 less to activate, and land creatures you control get +1/+1. So a lot going on with this card. First of all, it's very similar to Cavalier of Thorns because we get the mill and we get lands back from the graveyard. Now, obviously, you only mill 3 as opposed to 5, but it is 1 mana cheaper, which is a pretty big difference, right? 4 is a lot cheaper than 5. And, you know, it doesn't have to be within the top 5 like Cavalier. If there's already a land in your graveyard, you can get it back. You also get the trigger again when it attacks, so if the opponent can't stop you attacking or they don't have a blocker in play, this can really snowball the game in your favour. Then the other abilities, it discounts Nykthos, which is really huge. So it essentially is like triple green Devotion, because it essentially makes Nykthos only cost 1. It also stacks in multiples, so if you get 2 Blossoming Tortoises in play, Nykthos is 0 to activate, which is really, really big. It also works very well with Lair of the Hydra as well, because not only does it discount the activation to animate Lair, but it also gives it +1/+1, so it essentially gives it +2/+2, and again, stacks in multiples, so if you have 2 Blossoming Tortoises, it gives your Lair of the Hydra +4/+4, which is really nice as well. But in terms of the downsides, it doesn't have 4 power for a start, which means it doesn't draw off Cura. Now again, that's not really a deal breaker, but if this was a 4/3, I would be a fair bit higher on it. And then second of all, and probably the biggest issue I had with this card, is that it only mills 3. If this milled 4, I think I would be way, way higher on it, but the fail rate was the main thing that put me off this card. Now, I haven't run the numbers on a hypergeometric calculator, so there is a chance that I was just running through bad variants, but for this to be good, I think you really, really need to hit a land very consistently on the ETB trigger, right? 4 mana, while cheaper than Cavalier of Thorns, is still a lot more than the 3 mana cards like, you know, Topiary Stomper is a card that is a mana cheaper and guarantees a land in play whilst also triggering Cura as well. So if this milled 4, I'd be a lot higher on it. The awkward thing with it milling 3 is that Devotion doesn't really want to be running that many lands. Typically, Devotion wants to be running either 21 or 22 lands. And again, I've not run the numbers on it, but from my experience, it was whiffing just too often on the ETB trigger. So for Blossoming Tortoise to be good, I think you would want to be running a build with a higher land count. First of all, so that you just more consistently hit a land off the ETB, but secondly because there is some tension with Utopia Sprawl. So I think Utopia Sprawl is the single reason why Devotion is so good right now, but it does come with some deck building restrictions because you can only put it on a forest. So I think in order to consistently enable Utopia Sprawl, you need at minimum 15 actual forests in your deck. I'm running 16 in this build. You can probably get away with 15, but the awkward thing with Utopia Sprawl is that since you have to run such a high forest count, you don't really have that much room for utility lands. And the thing is with Blossoming Tortoise, you really want to be running a decent number of utility lands so that you can get more value off the triggers on this, right? So obviously you're running for Nykthos, which is the card you're most hoping to hit the first copy of Blossoming Tortoise, but for Blossoming Tortoise to be really effective, I think you want to be running more Lair of the Hydra. Now, as I mentioned, you can get away with 15, so I mean, one immediate thing I could do here is just go 15 Forest, 2 Lair of the Hydra, but another upside of going up on lands is that you could potentially, you know, if you went up to 24 lands, you could then go up to 4 Lair of the Hydra, for example, and really maximize the value you get off Tortoise, whilst also maximizing your chances of hitting a land off it as well. Now, the awkward thing about it is that, as I mentioned, Devotion doesn't really want to be running that many lands. So I think for Tortoise to be good from my experience, you would probably want to be running other cards that also incentivize you to be running more lands. One of which I think is Hollowhenge Wrangler. So this is a card that you're going to see in a lot of different builds of mine. I think this card is really, really cool. So you might not have seen it before. 5 mana 6/6. ETB, you seek a land. So, you know, you can potentially find Nykthos. It's another way to dig for it. And then the extra ability on this is really nice. You can discard a land to conjure a 5 mana 5/5 into your hand, and you can also activate this ability while Hollowhenge Wrangler is in your graveyard. So it's another payoff for milling, which is one of the reasons why I'm excited to run it alongside Blossoming Tortoise. That's also the reason why I'm running a single copy of Cityscape Leveler, because this deck has a lot of milling, right? We have 4 Blossoming Tortoise, 4 Cavalier of Thorns, so we're going to be milling a lot. That's, you know, Storm the Festival is run in most decks, and when you're running 4 Cavalier, 4 Blossoming Tortoise, running 4 Storm the Festival is really nice payoff because you can very easily mill it over. But I like the Wrangler here because it's a really good way to mitigate flood, right? If you either have this in your hand or you mill it into your graveyard of Blossoming Tortoise or Cavalier of Thorns, any lands you draw, you can just turn it into a 5-mana 5/5, which is very easy to cast off Nykthos. It draws you cards off the Kiora, so you can chain a bunch of 5/5s together to just completely, dominate the board, snowball the game as well. So if you did run a slightly higher land count, I think you could run a build with 4 Hollowhenge Wrangler to mitigate the flooding out. I did try a build like that was also running Kami of Bamboo Groves, if I can find that card. So here we go. This is basically Arboreal Grazer. That's a 1/1 that you can channel to put 2 forests into your hand. So the general idea of this was that 1 mana ramp is just so much better than 2 mana ramp. Llanowar Elves and Elvish Mystic are still viable, I think, in low numbers, but they're obviously very vulnerable to Orcish Bowmasters. Whereas Kami of Bamboo Groves, putting the land into play when it ETBs, it doesn't really matter if it then dies to a Bowmasters because you've already got the ramp. And then if you are running Kami of Bamboo Groves alongside Hollowhenge Wrangler, if you draw it later in the game, you can channel it to put 2 forests in your hand, which you can then discard to the Wrangler to put 5/5s into your hand. So there's some nice synergy going on there. But the Kami just felt awful. Honestly, these sorts of Arboreal Grazer effects are typically run in decks that run minimum of 26 lands. Stuff like Gates or Field of the Dead are the main decks that are interested in this sort of effect. So Kami just doesn't really work particularly well with what Devotion's going on. So from my experience, for Tortoise to be good, I think I would want to be running a Devotion deck where there are other cards that want you to have a slightly higher land count. If there's other reasons to go up to 24 lands, then I think I'm much more interested in Tortoise in general. So that's basically my lowdown on the Blossoming Tortoise. So one thing I wanted to highlight with this particular build is the wish board, because one big difference between this and the generic version that I just showed is that I'm running 4 copies of Pithing Needle, and this is mainly here as a consideration to Yawgmoth. So Yawgmoth combo can definitely be a tricky matchup for Devotion because they typically race quicker than you. They don't care about your creatures in play either because they're a combo deck, right? And so I don't think with the main deck setup, a lot of the Devotion decks can just afford to run 15 one-offs, but I don't think the main deck as is good enough to consistently beat Yawgmoth, as I mentioned, because they can just race you. Post-sideboard, they're also going to have more ways to stop Khan as well, so I think having Pithing Needle be able to bring in the main deck is a really good way of just slowing the opponent down, because if you draw a Needle, you can just Needle naming Yawgmoth, and then that slows the opponent down a lot, right? They have to then find an answer to your Needle before they can then get their Yawgmoth back online, which usually then just buys you enough time to set up your game plan and then just go over the top of them. So Needle is a really effective way to improve the Yawgmoth matchup. I think without having stuff to bring in, you are probably unfavored in that matchup, particularly post-sideboard when they start bringing in sideboard cards that are good against you as well. And then the only other difference here really is that I'm running Godfarrow's Statue, which is a card that I was high on early on because it's good if you get ahead in the mirror or against control, but as I played more and more, this card just didn't really feel as necessary, so it ended up getting cut. So this build overall is not one that I'm particularly high on or really recommend playing, but I wanted to talk about it because I think Blossoming Tortoise is definitely an interesting card going forwards. So this is the second build I wanted to highlight, and this is the very first build where I felt like I was onto something really powerful. So I went 19-4 with this build, and I believe I went 17-0 in the first 17 matches, so definitely a strong version of the deck for sure. And the main differentiation between this and other builds is that we're main decking the One Ring here. So One Ring, obviously one of the most generically powerful cards in the whole format, and I think it is very good in Devotion specifically. First of all, because you're a ramp deck, so you can very consistently cast this on turn 3, and One Ring on turn 3 is obviously very powerful for sure. I also think Devotion in general is a deck that can really benefit from the card draw you get off this, because it's very easy for you to empty your hand, right? If you use the One Ring to find the first copy of Nykthos, that just unlocks a ton of mana to enable you to just cast all of the cards that you draw off it. You have cards like Utopia Sprawl that are essentially free to cast. So, unlike a lot of other decks, you're not going to end up in situations where you have a bunch of cards stuck in your hand. Devotion is very good at casting everything that you draw off the One Ring. It also pairs very nicely with Kiora, because you can use Kiora to untap the ring to draw you a bunch of extra cards. So One Ring is just a generically powerful card that works very well in the archetype in general. In terms of the downsides of the One Ring, though, it does make you a lot more vulnerable to both Orcish Bowmasters and Shieldred, both of which the regular versions of Mono Green can typically ignore. Obviously, you're going to be drawing cards off Kiora occasionally, but for the most part, you're not really going to be drawing that much. So, more general versions of Devotion aren't as weak to Bowmasters or Shieldred, whereas the One Ring versions obviously will be, because they can just flash it in and deal you a bunch of damage when you're drawing cards, which is one of the main reasons why I'm running Voracious Hydra. So Voracious Hydra is really interesting because It basically gives you a way to interact in the early game. It's 2 pips of devotion, and even if the opponent doesn't have a creature that you want to fight, you can just make a really big creature to be able to pressure the opponent as well. So it's very flexible, but the main reason I'm running it in this particular build is because it's very good at killing Bowmasters and Shieldred. Specifically Bowmasters, because you can play this for 3 mana, X equals 1, kill the Bowmasters, and then just immediately unlock the One Ring. I think One Ring builds without Voracious Hydra are just too soft to Bowmasters, and Bowmasters is still very, very popular right now, so I definitely wouldn't run a version of the One Ring in Devotion without Voracious Hydra. Similarly, Shieldred can be an issue, and Voracious Hydra is a way to kill it. You know, obviously you need a lot more mana, you need 7 mana to do that, but, you know, you can often still activate the One Ring 1 or 2 times with the Shieldred in play to try and find Nykthos or try and get Cura online, which then does typically unlock the 7 mana you need for Hydra to kill Shieldred. The other nice upside of Hydra, though, is that it does just generally improve the matchups against those decks that require interaction. You know, as I mentioned, Devotion is typically weakest to decks that require early interaction, and whilst Hydra isn't really early interaction, because you do need to invest a lot of mana in it, you know, against something like Wizards, for example, you typically need 5 mana to be able to kill stuff like Symmetry Sage and Dreadhorde Arcanist, but you have main deck interaction, which is a big deal. That does go some way to improve the bad matchups, as I was talking about. So that's another nice upside of running the Hydra. And as I mentioned, it does work generically well with what the deck's trying to do. 2 pips of Devotion, you can trigger Kiora once you make it a 4/4 or higher as well. And even if the opponent doesn't have any creatures, you can just make this a really big threat that can just close games out. Particularly nice if you can get a Kramer's Memorial to give it haste as well. So One Ring, you know, Voracious Hydra does help improve some of the weaknesses of the One Ring. The other main weakness, though, is that it's very weak to Karn in the mirror match, and I played this quite early on. Since I've started testing Devotion, I have noticed that it's become a lot more popular on ladder, so I do think that this particular build is probably weaker in the mirror match, because if you tap out for Karn early on, and then the opponent just slams... Sorry, if you tap out for the One Ring early on, and the opponent just follows up with Karn, that's such a bad exchange for you, so... If the mirror is popular, I'm not sure this particular build is the way to go, but if you're trying to improve your matchup against the rest of the field, I think the One Ring is really, really good at helping those hands where you kind of run out of gas a little bit, particularly against the Thoughtseize decks as well. Other interesting cards that I want to talk about here, Polukranos Reborn. I like this card if you've got room for it. Triple green is very nice. We don't have to worry about the same issues with Old Growth Troll because it's legendary, so we can cast it off Halfling. And it does really improve the matchup against Wizards quite a lot because it has reach, right? They do have Flame of Venor in the deck, but they don't really typically run it as 4 copies. And outside of that, they typically need to expend 2 removal spells to kill it. So if you want to improve your matchup against Wizards specifically, I think this build is a really good way to go. Because you have Voracious Hydra, you have Polukranos, and the One Ring is also decent against them. Just slamming it, prevent any damage that you take, and then hopefully you can draw to an answer to their board state. So if you're looking for a build of Devotion where... you're good against the field and you specifically want to improve against Wizards, this is the way to go. If you're expecting a lot of mirror matches or there's a ton of ring hate, then maybe this isn't the way to go, but it's an interesting option for sure. In terms of the sideboard, nothing too special going on here. I've only got 3 Pithing Needles here because I couldn't find room for the 4th. Again, this is just anti-Yawgmoth tech that I bought into, bring in 2, keep 1 in the sideboard, and then outside of that, everything else is pretty much stock. If you wanted to improve the Yawgmoth matchup even further, you could probably trim something like a Karn Silex or a Portal to Phyrexia to make room for it. But that's basically this build in a nutshell. So this is the 3rd build that I wanted to highlight, and this is definitely one of my personal favourites. I think there's a lot of cool innovation going on here, and I definitely think there's a lot of potential in this list. So I'm actually going to show you 2 different variants of this list, but I'll get to that in a second. The main innovation in this particular list, though, is Up the Beanstalk. So this is a new card from the latest set, 2 mana enchantment, and when it ETBs, or whenever you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, you draw a card. So replaces itself for 2 mana. It's a cheap card that gives you some extra devotion, which is always nice. But the really nice thing about this card is that it's an insanely good value piece once you get your late game engines online, because typically in devotion, you're ramping into stuff, so you want to be running a decent number of expensive cards which can trigger Up the Beanstalk. So it's just a generically good value card, but it's more run here as a combo piece alongside Hollowhenge Wrangler. So Hollowhenge Wrangler is really, really sick with Up the Beanstalk because you can cast the Wrangler. Typically you need to have Nykthos for this to work, but if you have Up the Beanstalk in play, you cast the Wrangler, which draws you a card off the Beanstalk. Wrangler seeks you a land. You can then discard that land to conjure a Hollowhenge Beast, cast a Hollowhenge Beast, draw a card off Up the Beanstalk, and then if you draw a land, you can then do that again. Every Hollowhenge Beast and Hollowhenge Wrangler that you cast is also fueling your Nykthos, so you can then produce a ton of mana there. So typically, to fully combo off, you need Up the Beanstalk and Kiora, or 2 Up the Beanstalks, and then you could oftentimes just draw your whole deck off Wrangler. You're going to be drawing lands. You can then just discard those lands to Wrangler to then conjure more Hollowhenge beasts, cast those, and then just draw through your whole deck, and then you'll eventually hit more Nykthos. Once you hit the Nykthos, you'll then find Karn. You can just cast Karn, cast the Akroma's Memorial, which gives your whole board flying and haste, and then you can just attack in the air and deal 20 or 30 damage out of nowhere. So Up the Beanstalk is really nice here because it kind of acts as a really, really strong late game engine that's really good on value anyway, contributes towards your devotion, and is just a lot cheaper than Storm the Festival. So the one thing, the one notable difference between this variant and other versions is that it's not running Storm the Festival, because Up the Beanstalk kind of fulfills a similar role, right? It's a late game engine that draws you a bunch of cards, enables these kind of crazy combo bursty turns, if that makes sense. And the big difference is it's 2 mana, right? The big drawback of Storm the Festival is that it's 6 mana. So the big weakness of that is if you're up against a deck with interaction like Thought Seizes and they manage to strip away your early ramp, you can just get stuck with a bunch of Storm the Festivals in your hand. Whereas Up the Beanstalk, you can just get it into play early, and oftentimes you can just sneak this into play in your first few turns. A very, very common play pattern with this particular variant of the deck is turn 1 Utopia Sprawl, turn 2 Kiora, use Kiora to untap the land with Utopia Sprawl, and then you can just cast Up the Beanstalk to make use of that excess mana, and then you just got it in play. So once you do then start casting your more expensive cards, you start triggering it for value, and then once you get your Nykthos, you find your Wrangler, you can then just kind of go off from that point as well. So one drawback of Up the Beanstalk in the current meta, very similar to the One Ring, is that it is obviously very weak to Orcish Bowmasters and Shieldred, which again is why we've got Voracious Hydra here as a way to answer Orcish Bowmasters. And the other nice thing about Hydra in this particular build is we can obviously cast it for X=1 to kill Bowmasters, but if we cast it for X=3, it's also another creature that can trigger Up the Beanstalk, so it's very flexible in triggering that. Can also obviously trigger Kiora if we make it for X=4, so Hydra is very nice with Up the Beanstalk. The other variant that I wanted to show you though is basically foregoing the Voracious Hydra and running Storm the Festival. So as I mentioned, I think the Up the Beanstalk is a reasonable replacement for Storm the Festival, but you can obviously just run them both together. And then Storm also triggers Up the Beanstalk when you cast it regularly, and when you cast it with the flashback. You've also got Cavalier of Thorns, which triggers it as well, which also helps mill over the Hollowhenge Wrangler to get that engine online. So the big difference between the Voracious Hydra build and the Storm the Festival build is this is just much more generically powerful. You're much faster. So if you wanted to run a build that is just very linear and going to be able to win the mirror match more consistently and going to be able to beat the majority of other decks more consistently, this is the way to go. The big weakness of running this build over the Hydra build, though, is that you're much weaker to Orcish Bowmasters and Shieldred. Now, from my experience, you can play through a single Bowmasters with Up the Beanstalk, but if the opponent gets 2 Bowmasters down, or they have a Shieldred in play and you can't answer it, this build is a lot more sketchy there. But I think, if you want to win the mirror, and if you want to make the deck as linear and consistent as possible, this is definitely the way to go. Now, again, from my testing, I wasn't really able to pass which is better in my opinion. I think a lot of the time, Devotion is just best as a full linear deck where you're trying to race rather than interact. But Up the Beanstalk is obviously very weak to Bowmasters as well, so it's up to you which matchups you want to improve. If you want to beat the Bowmasters decks, Hydra is better. If you want to beat everything else, I think Storm the Festival is better. Then we've got some other interesting stuff to talk about here. I'm running a single copy of Elvish Mystic and a single copy of Llanowar Elves just because I felt like I wanted more ramp, right? With Up the Beanstalk, we're running more expensive cards. We're running 4 Wrangler, 4 Cavalier, 4 Storm the Festival. We're not running the 3 drops like, Polychronos or whatever, so you need more ramp in order to bridge the gap between your early plays and the 5 drops. So I felt like Halfling, Sprawl, and Wolf Haven just wasn't enough. And the other options aren't that great, honestly. So I'll quickly talk about them. I think Elvish Mystic and Llanowar Elves, as one of each, is fine, right? You are obviously weak to Bowmasters, and this is another concern I have with the Storm the Festival build as opposed to the Hydra build is, if you are against the Bowmasters deck, not only do you not have Hydra to kill the Bowmasters, but Bowmasters is also good against your 2 Dorks here as well. So I think out of the 2, I probably prefer the Hydra build. Otherwise, you're just too weak to Bowmasters, but it's an interesting conversation for sure. The other options that you've got here, I don't think you've really got any other good 1-drop options. As I mentioned, you've got stuff like Kami of Bamboo Graves and Arboreal Grazer, but they just don't really work in Devotion. In terms of the 2-mana options you've got Paradise Druid and Bramble Familiar as options. And then we've also got Forceful Cultivator, and I was running Forceful Cultivator in this build for quite a while, actually. And I think the build I had was running 3 Forceful Cultivators over the Elvish Mystic, the Llanowar Elves, and one of the Hollowhenge Wranglers. Not sure that's right, because I think Wrangler is such an important card of the deck. If I was going to run a build with Cultivator, I think I would probably be running 4 Wrangler, 3 Cavalier instead, because Wrangler is just such an important card in the deck. And then the awkward thing with Forceful Cultivator is you really want to be running as few actual lands as possible. So the trick with Forceful Cultivator is you would run Turn Timber Symbiosis over some of your lands. If I can find it here. Because Turn Timber Symbiosis is essentially a card that acts as a land when you need it to, but doesn't count as a land in your hand. So if you have a Turn Timber Symbiosis in your hand, Forceful Cultivator will still cost 2 mana, assuming you have no other lands. But the awkward thing with this is there's a lot of tension with Utopia Sprawl, because, as I mentioned, you really need at minimum 15 forests. So we can get that right. If we cut the Besagus and the Lair of the Hydras, we still have 15 forests here, and we can still run the 3 Turn Timber Symbiosis, but you're losing out on Besaju and Lair of the Hydra, which is a big issue, right? Especially post-sideboard, if the opponent Pithing Needles your Khan, you don't have any way to answer that without Besaju. And the other awkward thing is that Turn Timber Symbiosis doesn't work very well with Hollowhenge Wrangler because you can't discard it to the Wrangler. The other nice upside of Turn Timber Symbiosis, though, is that it also does trigger Up the Beanstalk, so it does increase your number of expensive cards to trigger Up the Beanstalk, but on balance, I just didn't really feel like Forceful Cultivator was worth it. The other awkward thing about it is that if you draw it alongside Nykthos, it's really, really bad, because then the absolute earliest that you're going to be able to cast Cultivator is turn 3, assuming you don't draw any other lands. So on balance, I just felt like Cultivator wasn't really worth it, and so I ended up going for Llanowar Elves Elvish Mystic, which then gives you access to Besaju and Lair of the Hydra again. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about here, which you might have already noticed, is that we've got a white splash going on here, and that's mainly for Yasharn and Portable Hull, but predominantly for Yasharn. So as I was playing more with Pithing Needle out the sideboard, it was still doing its job for the most part in the mono green builds, but I was less and less impressed with it as I was playing, because Yawgmoth is typically going to be bringing in more Haywire Mites against you because they're very good against Utopia Sprawl, which means they're much more likely to have an answer to your main deck Pithing Needles post-sideboard. But more importantly, a lot of the other sacrifice decks, like Samwise, were running multiple threats that you'd want to be able to Pithing Needle. So I've seen decks that were running Samwise and Confectioner combo, and so if you Pithing Needle a Cauldron Familiar, they can still just Collected Company into the Confectioner combo and then still go off. I came across some builds that were running stuff like Priest of Forgotten Gods, which you sometimes want to be able to Pithing Needle, and then they'll just go off with Yawgmoth. You know, some of the Samwise decks are also running a single copy of Yawgmoth, so even if you Pithing Needle Woe Strider or Cauldron Familiar, they can just Call of Calling for Yawgmoth and just pick apart your board with that anyway. So I really like the idea of having Yasharn in the sideboard instead, because the white splash is very much, well, not entirely free, but it's very easy to enable the white splash on this, because all you need to do is swap 4 Forest out for 4 Temple Garden, which does make the mana base slightly more painful, and does also make you vulnerable to Besaju if you put Utopia Sprawl in your Temple Garden. But outside of that, we also have Delighted Halfling, which can cast Yasharn because it's legendary, and you can also put Utopia Sprawl on white in matchups where you bring it in as well. So Yasharn is pretty, you know, the splash is literally just replacing 4 forests with 4 Temple Gardens, so it's pretty free, and I think it's so much more of a safe option against Yawgmoth and those sacrifice decks, because they typically will be bringing in artifact removal against you to stop Pithing Needle, and against those other variants where they have multiple cards like Priest of Forgotten Gods, or they've got Samwise and Confectioner combo, Yasharn just stops everything. And it also just works pretty well in your deck anyway, because you're a ramp deck that wants to be finding more lands anyway. You know, Yasharn finding you a forest is pretty nice. I absolutely do not think it's worth running a basic plains in the deck. Basic plains is going to cause you so many problems, but getting a forest off this is really nice to just ensure that you keep hitting land drops. It draws you a card off Kiora as well, so I think Yasharn is a really good way to improve the matchup against Yawgmoth and the other sacrifice decks at very low cost. I mean, obviously you do have to run the Temple Garden, and you do need to take 3 Khan Wishboard targets out in order to run this, but it's definitely felt worth it. This has massively improved the Yawgmoth matchup in my opinion. And then one nice upside of running the white splash is you also get access to Portable Hull, which is another nice option to improve the aggro matchups, because you can just go with 5 mana, you can go Khan, Portable Hull one of their creatures, Gives you another cheap out to Orcish Bowmasters, which is very relevant when you're playing Up the Beanstalk. It's also very nice against a deck like Auras, which you would have no good way of interacting with in the early game outside of that. And then in terms of some other changes that I made with this build, I started running liquid metal coating, which I think is very, very important. And when I link the deck lists for the other older builds, I will be updating them to include stuff like liquid metal coating. This isn't a card that I've been very high on in the past, but I think right now it's very, very important in the mirror match. Because if you can get a card down early and use liquid metal coating, either to stop the opponent activating Nykthos or activating a land with a bunch of Utopia Sprawls and Wallflower Havens on, that's a really, really good way of breaking serve in the mirror match. So I think liquid metal coating is a really good addition there as well. And then outside of that, nothing else to really talk about here. I have cut Pestilent Cauldron from the sideboard, which has meant that I've replaced Treasure Vault with Darksteel Citadel, and I just felt like Pestilent Cauldron, I just wasn't really going for it enough to warrant it over all of the other cards. There just wasn't really enough room for it. If I had a 16th sideboard card, I'd probably run Pestilent Cauldron and swap the Citadel for a Treasure Vault, but as things stand, I think everything else is too important. So that's this build. I'm really excited about it, and I do think Up the Beanstalk definitely potentially has a place in Devotion going forwards. In terms of the different versions, in my testing, I went 16-4 with a mono green variant running Pithing Needle, and then 23-6 with a Selesnya version for the Yasharn Splash. I definitely think the Selesnya version is just much better. I think Yasharn is a much more solid sideboard plan against the sacrifice decks, and the splash is virtually free, plus having access to Portable Hole is very nice, particularly against Bowmasters. And then in terms of Hydra versus Storm the Festival, I think it depends on the metagame, really. I think in terms of playing on ladder, I'd probably go for the Voracious Hydra build because I still expect to face Orcish Bowmasters, but if Bowmasters does go on the downswing and there's a bunch of mirror matches, then I do think the Storm the Festival version is probably better. So next up I want to highlight a build that is largely built around Grizzled Huntmaster. So this is a card that I've been very high on in Devotion in the past because it gives you another really nice toolbox in addition to Karn, meaning you're much more flexible and much less one-dimensional, which is really nice. So typically in the past, Huntmaster was really easy to enable because you were very reliant in old builds on your one-mana creature mana dorks like Lenarels, Elvish Mystic, and Avacyn's Pilgrim, and so being able to cash those in for one of the best cards out of your sideboard was a really nice synergy, whilst also getting them, the rest of the dorks out of your deck as well. Now with the addition of Utopia Sprawl, which is the main reason to be running Devotion right now, it does incentivize you to be running more non-creatures, which does make it more difficult to enable the Huntmaster. With Utopia Sprawl, you're much more heavily incentivized to run Wallflower Haven because you can stack them on the same land and then untap them with Kiora, which leads to really, really explosive starts. So in order to have enough creatures in the deck to consistently enable Grizzled Huntmaster, again, I've had to cut Storm the Festival from the deck to enable that, which I do think is reasonable. I still think it's fine because you still get access to powerful top end of Grizzled Huntmaster. Hollowhenge Wrangler does also somewhat give you repeatable top-end value as well. So I do think, cutting Storm the Festival isn't as bad. And Grizzled Huntmaster in this particular build gives you really nice flexibility. One of the big weaknesses of Mono Green Devotion is that you're very one-track, very linear until you can get your Karn online. And having Grizzled Huntmaster gives you ways to pivot and I feel like it does help to improve the weaker matchups. Now, as I mentioned, you do need to have enough creatures in your deck to consistently enable this. If you have Grizzled Huntmaster on turn 3 or later in the game, and you don't have a creature in your hand to use with the Huntmaster, that's really not great. I mean, it does still draw your card off Kiora, it does still give you 2 pips of Devotion, but you really need to run a high creature count for Huntmaster to be good. Now, in terms of potentially cutting Wallflower Haven, you could make an argument to maybe replacing Wallflower Haven with Paradise Druid, and then replacing Hollowhenge Wrangler with Storm the Festival, but I just think the fast starts with Devotion is so important. Even with Huntmaster, you're not really doing anything, super impactful to the board until turn 4 or 5, really. Sometimes turn 3 or 4 if you have a really fast start, but in order to get ahead and get to the point where Huntmaster and Karn are doing things, you need to have fast starts, and I just feel like Wallflower Haven is so much better than Paradise Druid because of Utopia Sprawl that I like running it this way. But I think you could definitely try builds with Paradise Druid instead of Wallflower Haven and still run Storm the Festival over the Hollowhenge Wrangler, but I prefer this setup as things stand. So the main reason that I'm running Huntmaster here is because it gives us access to creatures out of the sideboard. So Haywire Might and Cityscape Leveler are really nice because they're both cards that we can fetch off Karn and Grizzled Huntmaster. But the other cards that we get access to, first of all, we get Yasharn. So the really nice thing here is that we have main deck access to Yasharn. Again, the white slash is very free here because we got the Temple Garden, we got the Halfling, we got Utopia Sprawl that we can name on white. So if we are against Yawgmoth, particularly game 1 where they're not likely to have that many answers for it, being able to go turn 3 Huntmaster, fetch Yasharn, turn 4 Yasharn, oftentimes is just lights out against the sacrifice decks. It also means that we don't need to dedicate as many slots for that matchup. As you saw in the previous build, I was having to use 3 of my sideboard slots on Yushan, whereas here we only have to use 1, which is a really nice upside for sure as well. We also get Questing Beast, which is really nice, just generic play, right? If we play Grizzled Huntmaster, then we can often just fetch Questing Beast as a follow-up play on turn 4, which is very good against control, pretty good in the mirror match as well, because we can use it to attack down their planeswalkers, very good if the opponent has protection from the One Ring, because it can bypass it as well. Just a generically good card to get to apply pressure. You know, a 4/3 does apply a decent amount of pressure, so Huntmaster into Questing Beast is just a generic option to take. And we've also got Crater Hoof Behemoth as well, which is another nice finisher, right? You know, same thing, we've got Khan, which can grab a Kramer's Memorial to finish the game. If we're kind of comboing off and we have a bunch of mana off Nykthos, we can often just use Huntmaster to get Crater Hoof, cast Crater Hoof, and just immediately win the game. So Grizzled Huntmaster not only gives us good early game options against decks like Control and Sacrifice, but it also gives us access to another finisher. And then we also have Voracious Hydra here as well, which is another really nice interactive option. You know, we can use it to take out early creatures. We can also use it to take out bigger creatures like Shieldred. You could consider running Tolsimir, which is a card that I've been trying with the White Slash as well. The really nice thing about Tolsimir is that it spreads across 2 bodies and gains you life. So if you're up against a deck like Wizards, for example, Tolsimir is really, really solid, because we get the Tolsimir, 2 bodies in play, gain some life back, and we can use the Wolf to kill, you know, their Symmetry Sage or their Dreadful Darkness. The weakness of running Voracious Hydra is that if the opponent has a removal spell for the Hydra, they can just kill the Hydra in response to the fight trigger, and you don't actually get to kill their creature. They can obviously kill the Tolsimir token, but you get 2 bodies and you gain the 3 life. But the reason I like Voracious Hydra is that it's just much more flexible, right? We can get it to pay X=1 for 3 mana and kill an Orcish Bowmasters. If the opponent has a Shieldred, Tolsimir doesn't kill that, whereas Voracious Hydra can kill Shieldred for 7 mana. And then if we just need a really big threat, you know, if we have a ton of mana and we've got an Akramer's Memorial, we can just fetch Voracious Hydra, make it 20/20 and just attack out of nowhere. So the flexibility on Hydra gives it the edge there. And then I've also got a single copy of Tangled Florahedron, just as a fetchable land. So for missing land drops, we can just use Huntmaster to turn one of our creatures into a tap land as well. And so the flexibility here is really the big thing for me. Getting main deck access to your Yushan is really huge. If you can think of a better card for the mirror match than Questing Beast, definitely let me know in the comments, because I've been trying to brainstorm stuff. I was initially on Sawtusk Demolisher. I think Sawtusk Demolisher is really good in the mirror. I'm going to get to a build which is running that in a minute, but the awkward thing with Huntmaster is that Huntmaster is a human and you can't mutate onto humans, so unfortunately that doesn't work. So if you can think of another card that's good in the mirror match, I also thought of Angel. I can't remember the name of the card, but it's an angel that basically stops the opponent from playing stuff ahead of curve. But the issue with this card is that it's not legendary, so we can't cast it off halfling, so we would need to have Temple Garden or Sprawl on white for it to be castable, and it becomes bad pretty quickly, right? As soon as it gets to turn 6, the opponent can basically just cast every single card in their deck, so I don't think that's a good option. So long story short, if you have a good option other than Questing Beast that can improve the mirror match, definitely let me know in the comments. But Questing Beast is pretty good in the mirror, right? If the opponent gets a Khan down or a Kiora, we can often just use it to attack the opponent and kill down their planeswalkers, which is really nice. But then outside of that, you know, other stuff that we've got in the deck to enable it. As I said, we do need a high creature count, so that's why I'm running Llanowar Elves here, in addition to the Delighted Halfling. Again, you could consider running Paradise Druid or Bramble Familiar, but even though Llanowar Elves is weaker to Bowmasters, I think it's, you know, the difference between 1 and 2 mana is absolutely huge. The reason I'm running 2 Llanowar Elves here as opposed to 1 Llanowar Elves, 1 Elvish Mystic, is you want to run cards of the same name, because if you have 2 in your hand with Huntmaster, you can replace them both. And similarly, if you have a Llanowar Elves in your hand and you replace it with Huntmaster, you can get the other Llanowar Elves out of your deck with the Huntmaster to reduce the number of dead draws. I'm also running Topiary Stomper here, which is an interesting choice at the 3 mana slot. So, as I mentioned, I'm not very high on Old Growth Troll. I think Polukranos is a very good option, particularly if you want to improve the Wizards matchup. But the main reason I've gone for Topiary Stomper here is because we have 8 5-drops. And so Topiary Stomper being able to come down on turn 2 off your Halfling Elves or Utopia Sprawl guarantees you that you can play your Hollowhenge Wrangler or Cavalier of Thorns on the following turn, assuming you have your land drop for the turn. So Topiary Stomper is really nice, draws you off Kiora, is double green so we can cast it off Halfling, and basically guarantees that we can cast our Hollowhenge or Cavalier the following turn. Speaking of which, you know, I think since we cut Storm the Festival, you do need to run Hollowhenge Wrangler as a way to mitigate Flood, as a way to give you kind of this top-end explosive thing. I think in general, Storm the Festival would probably be the better card in this deck, but as I mentioned, we do need to have enough creatures in the deck for Huntmaster, and as I mentioned with the Beanstalk build, even without Beanstalk, Hollowhen's Wrangler plus Kiora is a really sick combination here as well. So I really like this build, in particular if you want to give the deck more flexibility. You know, Devotion is a very rigid deck, and so having, you know, I think this is probably the variant that I would prefer to face Yawgmoth with, because we have the main deck access to Yasharn. We have 4 copies of Huntmaster as opposed to only 3 copies of Yasharn, so I feel like this build is the best if you want to tackle the sacrifice decks. Having the flexibility to grab finishers and interaction also potentially means that you're good against the decks that require interaction, because you have main deck access to Voracious Hydra as well. So if you want to give the deck flexibility, this is definitely another way to build it for sure. So the last couple builds that I want to show you here are builds that are targeted on winning the mirror match more consistently, because the mirror against other Devotion decks has become increasingly popular since I started testing. I believe the top 2 players on the ladder right now, Sky Blue Keppel and Gottlieb, are both running Devotion, and I'm consistently facing a lot of top 100 mythic opponents on Devotion right now as well. So the deck is definitely increasing in popularity. And honestly, the mirror match is kind of miserable to play. A lot of the time, it just comes down to who has the fastest start. And so running a build that is targeted at the mirror match does seem like a pretty good place to be right now. So this particular build is definitely a pet version of mine that I really like in the mirror match. And I also think just has a lot of potential in other matchups as well. And this is a build that is built around, again, Up the Beanstalk, but also Sawtusk Demolisher. So everything I mentioned in the previous Up the Beanstalk video applies here. You know, that's the reason why I'm running Voracious Hydra to kill Orcish Bowmasters and stuff like that. But the real innovation here is Sawtusk Demolisher, which is a 6 mana 6/6 with trample, but we can mutate it for 4 mana, and when you do mutate it, it triggers Up the Beanstalk. Now, unfortunately, if you do mutate it, it doesn't trigger Kiora. If you hardcast it for 6 mana, it does, but being able to cast a 4 mana card that triggers Up the Beanstalk is really nice. And the really sick thing about this in the mirror match is that you can use it to either destroy the opponent's lands or their planeswalkers are the main 2 things that come up. But since we run a bunch of mana dorks, we can very consistently mutate this on turn 3, and using this to mutate on turn 3 and either kill the opponent's Nykthos or kill a land that they've loaded up with a bunch of Utopia Sprawls, you know, is very common because of Kiora for the Devotion opponents to go Forest Utopia Sprawl, and then, like, you know, Utopia Sprawl and Wolfwallow Haven all onto the same land. And if you go turn 3 Sawtusk Demolisher, blow up that land, give you a 3/3, that cuts them off like 3 or 4 mana immediately on turn 3, which puts them so much further behind and makes it really difficult for them to race you, which is the main way that you win the mirror match. Even outside of the mirror, Sawtusk Demolisher on turn 3 is really good against most decks anyway, right? You get a 6/6 with trample and get to blow up their land at worst. So if you're on the play and you get to blow up one of their lands, that's sick. If they have another problematic non-creature permanent, you can blow that up as well. And on top of that, you also have a 6/6 in play as well. Now, you do have to make some deck building considerations in order to enable this. You can't run any humans because you can't mutate on it. And you do need to be running a lot of creatures, or, you know, this is just a 6 mana 6/6 in your hand that you can't mutate. So we've got Halfling, we've also got Elvish Mystic and Llanowar Elves here as early creatures, and then we've also got Paradise Druid, which I think is really, really important here, particularly against interactive decks. Having this have hexproof, you can cast it on turn 2, then you're guaranteed to be able to mutate on it on turn 3, even if the opponent has single target removal. So you do need to be running a lot of early creatures to consistently enable the Sawtusk, but it's definitely felt worth it and really does improve the matchup in the mirror match. Again, we have a lot of top end cards to trigger the Up the Beanstalk. The one drawback of this particular build, though, is that I have noticed that it does tend to run out of gas a little bit more than other builds because you're not running Storm the Festival or Cavalier of Thorns, for example, but I still think this is a solid build. Again, if you're not worried about Bowmasters, you could definitely consider running Cavalier instead of Voracious Hydra, and I think that would definitely help with some of the issues of running out of gas a little bit. But again, that then makes you more weak to Orcish Bowmasters, so there's definitely a trade-off there. I definitely don't think you can replace Voracious Hydra with Storm the Festival because it doesn't hit Sawtusk Demolisher, but you could definitely consider replacing this with Cavalier of Thorns if you just wanted to go full-on, maximize the mirror match. But again, I like Voracious Hydra because otherwise you're pretty weak to the Orcish Bowmasters decks instead. Then sideboard is pretty much the same as previous builds. Again, we've got the Yasharn tech. I think the White Splash is very much free. Portable Hole here, another nice addition. Then, you know, nothing too much extra to add here, but Sawtusk, really, really good in the mirror match, and also just a generically good card anyway. So I'm a big fan of this build, particularly if you want to improve the mirror match. So the last build that I want to highlight here is definitely another one that's hard targeted at winning the mirror match, and that is Tooth and Nail Devotion. So I want to give a quick shout out to Gottlieb, who I believe is the current rank 2 player, who I faced in the mirror match, and they beat me pretty handily with a Tooth and Nail variant. So the idea here is that in the mirror match, whoever gets off to the fastest start normally wins, but they take a while to actually kill you. Whereas Tooth and Nail is just a combo way to win off 9 mana. So even if the opponent gets off to a faster start than you, assuming you can get to 9 mana, which is pretty easy to do in the mirror match because the opponent doesn't close the game out very quickly, you can just use Tooth and Nail for 9 mana, put Xenagos and Wildspine Worm from your deck into play, use Xenagos to turn Wildspine Worm into a 30-30 trample, and just attack for lethal out of nowhere. So it's just a way to just go over the top of the opponent, even if they get off to a faster start than you. Even outside of the mirror match, this is obviously just a very powerful way to win the game overall. So this build is basically meant to be good against the mirror match and against slower decks in general. Now obviously the big weakness is that Tooth and Nail being 9 mana is a lot more expensive than if you're running a regular build with Storm the Festival, for example. So I do think that the main deck is generally worse against the faster aggro decks that Devotion is already typically bad against. But if you're expecting a lot of mirror matches, I think this build is pretty nice. In terms of the aggro matches though, you do have a pretty nice sideboard switch up plan here with Defense of the Heart, because if you do come up against a go wide aggro deck or a deck like Yawgmoth, for example, or typically any Bowmaster's deck, you can bring in Defense of the Heart, and then basically you can use this as a way to cheat Wildspine Worm and Xenagos into play, as long as the opponent has 3 creatures into play. So even though game 1 you're definitely going to be weaker because Tooth and Nail is so much more expensive and takes longer to set up, post sideboard you do have a reasonable pivot option. Now I'm not super sure this really fixes most of the issues with the deck, because against a deck like Wizards, for example, it's very easy for them to kill you with only 2 creatures in play, and if the opponent knows that you've got this, again, they can just play around it fairly easily. Similarly against Yawgmoth, if you play a Defense of the Heart, and they have a Yawgmoth, they can just sacrifice all of their creatures so that they only ever have 2 in play. So Defense of the Heart is definitely a nice option to try and address the slowness that Tooth and Nail adds to the deck against the faster decks, but I don't think it's a completely catch-all answer to that issue, if that makes sense. In terms of the main deck though, there definitely are some considerations that I've made, and specifically I think out of all of the builds that I'm showing, this is definitely the variant that I've done the least amount of testing with. So again, I'm really not sure if this is the best variant. 4 Tooth and Nail is probably too many, considering it's such an expensive card, but I wanted to see how the build does with 4 Tooth and Nail, and this build has felt pretty decent. So in terms of other changes that I've made to enable Tooth and Nail, I feel like you need more ramp in order to get up to 9 mana. So I'm obviously running Halfling Sprawl and Wolfwallow Haven as usual, but I'm also running 2 Utopia Stomper and 4 Bramble Familiar, so we have a lot more ramp as a ways to get to 9 mana more consistently. The reason that I'm running Bramble Familiar over Llanowar Elves, Elvish Mystic or Paradise Druid is because it also doubles up as a top end. So obviously the big weakness of running more ramp is that you're more likely to be left in scenarios where you have a lot of ramp and nothing to spend the mana on, and Bramble Familiar acting as early ramp and also top end is really nice to help mitigate that issue. Additionally, in this specific build, because we're running Wildspine Worm, we have more good targets to hit off the fetch quest as well. You know, I've managed to win some games where my opponent stone-brained away Tooth and Nail, and then I managed to fetch quest into Wildspine Worm, and then fetch quest into Xenagos and combo off anyway, which is pretty nice. The mill off the fetch quest is also pretty nice with Timeless Witness, which we have as another backup. So Timeless Witness is mainly here as a way to get back Tooth and Nail from the graveyard. So if we mill Tooth and Nail over with Cavalier of Thorns or Fetch Quest, we can eternalize the Timeless Witness to get back Tooth and Nail. If we mill over Wildspine Worm, it's not really much of an issue because it just shuffles it back in. But if we mill over Xenagos, that does stop Tooth and Nail working. So Timeless Witness is also another way that we can just get Xenagos back from the graveyard to our hand as well. And then Utopia Stomper, again, just extra ramp that also synergizes pretty well with Kiora. So again, not 100% sure that this is the best version of Tooth and Nail, but if you want a build that's targeted at the mirror, this is definitely another way to go about it. So those were all the builds that I wanted to highlight. I've been having so much fun playing Devotion, and it's quite rare for me to not be able to hone in on a version that I like the most, which I think is kind of testament to how flexible the Devotion deck is in terms of deck building. And also, I think the metagame in Historic is actually changing quite frequently at the moment, which is pretty refreshing to see, because I feel like there have definitely been periods recently where it's felt quite stale for quite a while. In terms of the build of the deck that I'm personally most excited about, I really like the Up the Beanstalk version. I think that deck's been performing really well for me. I think the Huntmaster version is definitely a very nice option to have access to, particularly if you expect to face a lot of Yawgmoth. Being able to Huntmaster for your Shan seems really nice there as well, and the flexibility does help to fix a lot of the linear problems that Devotion has. And then in terms of the mirror match, I think the Sawtusk version has definitely been my favourite so far. So if you expect the mirror match a lot, that's definitely definitely a version that I'd look into playing. I think the One Ring variant is a really interesting, generically powerful powerful version of the deck that was probably good a few days ago when I was initially testing it, but as the mirror match and opposing Khan the Great creators become more popular, I think the One Ring does become more of a liability. However, if the metagame does evolve and Wizards, for example, starts to become more popular, I think Wizards is one of the best decks to fight Devotion. Then the One Ring version with 3 Pelucranos, 4 Voracious Hydra, and 4 One Ring might be the best version to fight against Wizards. So again, it's a really interesting time in Historic right now, and it's really interesting to see how the metagame is going to evolve and which version of Devotion is going to be the best. Next up, I've got some gameplay with 3 different versions of the deck so you guys can see it in action. The first match is going to be the One Ring variant, the second match is going to be one of the Up the Beanstalk variants, and then the third match is going to be the Sawtusk variant, so you'll get to see all 3 of them in action. I hope you enjoyed the video. Definitely let me know in the comments if you like this style of video and you'd like to see me do more in future. And also definitely let me know if you've been working on Devotion yourself, what your build looks like and how the matchup spreads felt. But anyway, let's just get straight into the gameplay. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so we're going second here. And only 1 lander, but I think we have to keep this, right? We've got Sprawl on 1. Just got to hope the opponent doesn't have a Thoughtseize here. Oh, wow. Spoke too soon. That's kind of rough. So now we really need to draw the second land off the top. If we do, though, I think we're still in a reasonable spot. Okay, yikes. Didn't hit a land there. So really, really need to hit one this next draw step, or we're in trouble. If we do, though, I think we're in a reasonable spot. You know, Thoughtseize means the opponent's not developing to the board this turn. They got Bitter Blossom. Okay, sick. We found the second land. That's huge. So now we can go for Wolfwallow Haven. Bitter Blossom could be an issue if they're playing the tokens deck, maybe, because then they can turn it into a real clock with Intangible Virtue, which I imagine is what they're on. I was going to say they could also be on Sacrifice, but with Dawn of a New Age, I'm almost certain they're going to be on tokens here. Wow, okay, we hit another land perfect. So we could just jam Khan here, but I think I definitely want to get the Wolfwallow Haven down so that if we draw another land off the top, we can cast Storm the Festival next turn. And now we can just go Voracious Hydra X=1 and kill one of their tokens so that if they do have a way to boost their board, like Intangible Virtue, we can take this out before it grows any bigger. Or if they are running stuff like Rite of Oblivion, you know, they have less fodder for that as well. So now if we draw a land off the top, we can just jam Storm the Festival next turn. Since they're on black-white, I very much doubt they have a way to stop that unless they're running main deck Reprieve or Mana Tithe, which is pretty unlikely, I think. Okay, another Dawn of a New Age, so quite a slow start from the opponent here, which I'm very happy to see. So here, I think I'm just going to go for Khan and probably grab a land so that we're guaranteed to go for Storm the Festival next turn. And Khan also survives here as well, because they've only got a 1/1 in play, which is pretty nice. So just going to grab a Treasure Vault as a land, and then might as well attack here. You know, I very much doubt they've got any ground creatures with haste, so no real risk of not having it back to block. And now I feel pretty good, right? Even if they have a powerful play this turn, we've got Storm the Festival next turn. Okay, there is Intangible Virtue, which is kind of scary, but, you know, we're already at Storm Festival mana and at 20 life, and they're having to focus down the Khan here, so I definitely feel like we're ahead at this point. Just hope the opponent doesn't have anything else too strong here. You know, especially if they pass without putting Lurrus into hand. Okay, they do just put Lurrus into hand. Okay, that's kind of best possible for us, I think. So now the opponent's tapped out, we can just jam Storm the Festival, see what we hit. Oh wow, that's not a bad one. So we can either go Nykthos Kiora, Nykthos Cavalier, or Cavalier Kiora here. I think I'd like going for Cavalier Kiora because we have the forest with the 2 Wolfwallow Havens on, so we can, as long as we hit a land off the Cavalier, we can just untap the forest and put 1 ring into play. Maybe it's a little bit greedy not going for the Nykthos, but I feel we have, you know, getting 1 ring in play here, we have so many looks at finding the Nykthos, and we already have a land that's untapping for 3 mana off Kiora anyway, so plus I definitely want to get the Cavalier into play to be able to block the tokens. So oh wow, we found another Storm the Festival. So yeah, I feel very good about this spot now. So yeah, we'll see what the opponent has, but we have so many options here. We got Storm the Festival in hand, 2 in graveyard. We're drawing off the 1 ring, so yeah, I feel like we're in a really commanding position now. So they attack the Khan, we'll definitely block 1 of the tokens. We do lose the Khan, but we've got a second one in hand, so that's not really too much of an issue at all. Okay, they go for Lurrus, and they can start looping Dawn of a New Age, which is... well, they choose not to, so they almost certainly have Orcish Bowmasters here then. Interesting spot. So I think I'm going to activate the 1 ring first, because I want the Bowmasters in play so that we can potentially kill it with Voracious... well... I'd rather them have it in play now than you know, potentially do it later. And I also want to see what I hit. You know, they can obviously kill the Hydra and ping the Kiora here, but that's not really too much of an issue. So we have a lot of options here. I mean, obviously the downside of killing the Bowmasters first is that they can just get it back with Lurrus. So I think we need to focus on killing Lurrus first. We could obviously go for Voracious Hydra here. But I kind of want to save the Voracious Hydra for the Bowmasters. So let's just see how much mana I've got here. So we got 4, and then we could just jam Storm the Festival, but we do have enough mana here to go Khan plus Cityscape Leveler, I think, right? If we play the other forest from our hands. So I think I like going for Khan here, grab Cityscape Leveler to kill the Lurrus, and then we do draw another card, which will give them another Bowmasters trigger, but we can then just kill the Bowmasters next turn with Voracious Hydra before we activate the One Ring. And even if they have Fatal Push for the Hydra, which it doesn't look like they do because it's giving away priority, that they don't have anything right here, then we still have, you know, multiple Storm the Festivals. So even though they do have a Bowmasters in play and we have the ring, I'm really not concerned about this spot. We can also obviously just use the Cityscape Lever to attack and kill the Bowmasters as well. So I feel pretty good about this spot. Okay, Legion's Landing, that's completely fine. See if they attack the Khan again. Okay, they do attack on the Khan, which is fine. We can just block the 2-2 with the Cavalier. And they just ship it back. So it would be a little bit rough if they have a second Bowmasters here, but it is what it is. Going to use the Voracious Hydra first here to take out the Orcish Bowmasters, and then we can use the Cityscape Leveler either to take out the Intangible Virtue or the Bitter Blossom. See if they got the second Bowmasters here. Okay, they don't. That's obviously great. Now we have Beseiju to kill their other stuff as well. We get the Utopia Sprawl down here, so yeah, we have a ton of options. We obviously still have the Kiora untap as well, so we have access to a ton of mana here. Just trying to think if we can win this turn somehow. Right, we have Khan. We could get a Chroma's Memorial potentially. We don't quite have lethal, but you know, it would make it really hard for the opponent to race. Or we could just go Portal to Phyrexia. I think I'm just going to go for that. Make them sack 3. They get to keep the 5/5, but we can just attack with the... Oh, I guess they can also make a Merix token, sure. But then we also get to start reanimating stuff with the Portal, so... Yeah, I imagine this is lights out, you know. This is the sort of deck that really has to get underneath Devotion to win. You can't beat it with the long game. So I'm going to take out the Bitter Blossom here just to stop the steady flow of tokens, and then we can just kill the Virtue next turn. Yeah, opponent just scoops it up. So this isn't a matchup where we want to be sideboarding, really, I think. You know, there are some matchups where you sideboard, like, you know, if you've got extra Pithing Needles, you obviously want to bring them in against Yawgmoth. And then against the very fast decks like Wizards on the draw, I sometimes board out Khan for stuff like... the Fourth Ring and then Sky Sovereign and like little pieces of interaction there because Khan is a little bit too slow. But for the most part, unless I'm bringing in Pithing Needles against stuff like Yawgmoth, I normally just resubmit going into games 2 and 3. But yeah, like I think Devotion in its current state feels like it could have the potential to push out the slower decks in the format. Because it's just so good against the mid-range decks, so good against the kind of slower decks like I don't know, tokens can have fast starts, but compared to a deck like Wizards or Auras where they can really race you, those are the sorts of matchups where Devotion really tends to struggle. So this hand is obviously a little bit slow, which is a bit of a concern when you're going second, but I basically always hard mulligan any hand that doesn't have, you know, a piece of 1 or 2 mana ramp. So I think I have to keep a hand with the Wolfwallow Haven on 2 here. Okay, Shadow Summoning. So opponent can have a pretty fast clock if they follow that up with Intangible Virtue, but thankfully we do have the Voracious Hydra, which we can play for X=2 to kill one of them next turn anyway. Wedding Announcement is scary here, as is Lingering Souls. Wow, they Fragment Reality the Wolfwallow Haven. I mean, that gives us a Delighted Halfling, so that essentially does nothing unless they have a kill spell for the halfling as well. Let's see what else they've got. Oh, do they have another removal spell? That would slow us down a fair bit, but if they spend another removal spell on the halfling, wow, they do. I mean, we can still just play Hydra next turn and kill their 1/1 anyway, which I think I'm going to do. I don't want to just do nothing for the turn. And killing this token also means that they no longer have a another sacrifice option for their Rite of Oblivion. And then we've already got the 5th land here for Cavalier, so there's a chance we might not have anything to play next turn, but we've got the Hydra in, which is like holding the ground here, stopping them attacking with their ground creatures. So unfortunately we don't have anything to play this turn, but now we have Nykthos as well, so we have Cavalier next turn, Storm the Festival the turn after that, so... And the opponent, again, off to a pretty slow start here. Now, they do have Rite of Oblivion, which is very good against Cavalier, right? Dodges the death trigger, but... Okay, and they do have Virtue, so they are mounting a reasonable offense here. And I guess if they find their 4th land, they can just kill the Cavalier, but I still feel at 13 we're probably going to do a decent job of stabilizing here. So with a Nykthos in hand, and I don't think tokens is likely to have any way to kill Nykthos, I think I'm just going to take a forest here. Because we're not able to activate the Nykthos this turn anyway. We can just play Nykthos next turn and just, you know, go crazy with probably Storm the Festival, but we'll see. Yeah, okay, so they did find the 4th land. Wow, they don't use the Rite of Oblivion. I would have thought for sure they'd fire off Rite of Oblivion on the Cavalier. You know, probably sack the Legion's Landing, maybe. Wow, they don't even put Lurrus into hand. So, do they have another Bowmasters here, maybe? I mean, Kiora is a pretty nice draw here. Now we can go Kiora, untap Nykthos into Storm. Actually, I think I'm gonna lead on Cavalier first. Because if we can find another land off the Cavalier, we can just play Storm the Festival in addition to it anyway. Maybe it's correct to do it the other way around, not 100% sure. Wow, okay, so the opponent doesn't have another Bowmasters. I assume they would have flashed it in if they did have another one, so I wonder what the card in their hand is. I would have thought they would for sure put Lurrus into hand otherwise. So even though they have Bowmasters in play, I think it's still fine to get one ring in. We don't have to activate it this turn, and we can find, you know, another way to remove it off the Khan. So a lot of options here. I think I'm just going to grab Portal to Phyrexia again. Again, they can use the Rite of Oblivion to take out the Cavalier, but we have the Kiora to give us the mana for Portal anyway. I'm not going to activate the one ring. Okay, yeah, opponent just skews up. So yeah, we got there. Nice. Okay, so we're going second here. And yep, this looks good. Right, we've got 2 pieces of ramp, 2 Beanstalks, and Hollowhenge Wrangler as a top end. 2 Beanstalks and Hollowhenge Wrangler is a sick combo, right? As long as the opponent's not on, you know, double Bowmasters, I think we should be good. Okay, mirror match is interesting. I'm very surprised the number of people who are keeping hands without a play on turn 1 or 2, though. I basically always mulligan any hand that doesn't have a play on turn 1 or 2. So this is an interesting spot, whether we want to be more mana efficient and go for Up the Beanstalk or just get more ramp into play. Since we are playing the mirror match, I think just getting more mana into play is probably the priority here. Because now we have enough mana for Hollowhenge Wrangler guaranteed, and if we draw a land off the top, we can go for Storm the Festival, so... See what the opponent has here. Okay, they go for Kiora. See if they got anything off the untap. No, okay, they just ship it back, sure. Okay, we found a land, so now we can go for Storm the Festival, which is obviously sick. Okay, not the best hit, though. So we get another Utopia Sprawl, which is an extra mana and an extra devotion, and Nykthos, so... Unfortunately, we didn't get anything in play to pressure the Kiora, so that wasn't a great hit, but it does set us up pretty well for next turn, right? We can get Beanstalk plus Hollowhenge online, which is a pretty sick engine, particularly now that we've got Nykthos as well. So now we'll see what the opponent's got. Okay, yeah, they got Cavalier, so now the opponent's getting their engines online as well. Let's see what they hit here. And they've already got Nykthos in play, so it doesn't really matter. They just find another land, but they do hit a Storm the Festival, so that's kind of annoying. So interesting, we've got a lot of options here. I think... I think I like leading on the Beanstalk here. I want to get that online because Beanstalk plus Wrangler is really sick and should help us pull ahead on terms of card advantage. I think I'm going to wait to play the land because if we draw... I'm going to lead on the second Beanstalk first here. Now, even... Oh, wow, okay, we drew Kiora, perfect. I was going to say, even if we... don't go off crazily this turn. Next turn we should be good, but now we've got Kiora as well. We should be we should be good to, you know, pop off a decent amount here, or at least draw a ton of cards. So now we get to draw 2 off the Beanstalks. Wow, another Kiora. Okay, sick. So as you can see, this just chains a bunch of stuff together. Draw another bunch of cards. Now we can go Kiora. We can play another land and untap the Nykthos here. And now I think we could either go for Khan here, or we could go for more Wranglers. So if we go for Khan, we only have access to 5 mana. So, I think I'm still going to go for it, though. I want to get Khan into play, and then I think the best option here is Liquid Metal Coating. We could obviously go for a more expensive card, but if we Coating and then upkeep, lock down their Nykthos, that really cuts them off a lot of mana here. And they obviously can't really cleanly attack through the Hollowhenge Wrangler either with their Cavalier. You know, Mono Green doesn't really have any interaction outside of Khan, so I don't think there's any way they're really going to be able to attack down Khan this turn. So now they're basically just stuck with 5 mana here, and well, I guess 6 if they have a land drop and they untap with Kiora, but I guess they could also have a second Nykthos, but forcing them to cycle the second Nykthos now is pretty reasonable. And even then, you know, they don't have that big a board, and then we should really be able to pop off next turn. Even if we don't draw anything great, we have Storm the Festival. We can also turn all 3 of these lands into 5/5s. Okay, they did have the second Nykthos, so the opponent could have a pretty reasonable turn here, but again, forcing them to use the second Nykthos up here, as opposed to, you know, if we hadn't locked down that Nykthos, they could have gone activate, untap, activate again. Wow, opponent just scoops it up. I mean, they were already pretty far behind there, so here, don't think we're going to be sideboarding. You know, the only matchups where I ever really sideboard are against Sacrifice, where we obviously bring in Yashan, usually in place of some of the Up the Beanstalks, because almost all the Sacrifice decks are running 4 Bowmasters. And you don't really tend to win on card advantage that much in those matchups anyway. And then I also sometimes board out Khan on the draw against fast decks as well. But especially in the mirror, I'm happy to just run the main deck back as it is. Okay, so opponent leads on Llanowar Elves. We'll do the same ourselves. And then next turn we can go either Wolfwallow Haven into Up the Beanstalk, or probably just Kiora. I think getting Kiora into play earlier is going to be good, and then, you know, the following turn we can get Wolfwallow Haven on one of our lands and start producing a ton of mana that way. So we are missing a bit of top end, but this is, you know, the kind of spot where I think Beanstalk is really nice, because it, you know, it cantrips when it enters the battlefield, which hopefully digs you towards more expensive cards to trigger the Beanstalk more and just, you know, snowball the card advantage. And the other really nice thing about it is that it's way easier to slot in the early game, you know, as opposed to something like Storm the Festival, where, you know, you're not going to be casting it until you've already got all your ramp online. Okay, opponent does have Huntmaster though, which is kind of scary. So I wonder what they grab in this spot. Maybe Voracious Hydra to try and kill one of my Llanowar Elves. Maybe if they're missing lands, they might need to get something like, you know, Kazandi Mammoth or Florahedron maybe. What do they exile here? Okay, they exile another Huntmaster. So it'll be interesting to see what they get here. I'm not 100% sure what they would go for. Wow, they didn't get a land. Interesting. I guess they do have Nykthos, so maybe they don't feel it's as urgent. So I've got a lot of options here. I'm mainly debating whether I want to run out the Temple Garden first, or whether we want to use the Nykthos. I think I want to go for Temple Garden first here, because then we can go Wolfwallow Haven into Wolfwallow Haven, then untap it with Kiora, and then Beanstalk. And if we draw something else that we can cast here, that'll be really nice. Just a land, so a bit of a break, but, you know, we've got another draw step to try and find something good here. And if it is something that costs 5 or more, you know, if we can find a Hollowhenge Wrangler here, for example, that's going to absolutely pop off, because we've already got Beanstalk and Kiora online, and we've got Nykthos as well, plus another Kiora in hand. So this kind of highlights how good Wrangler is with Beanstalk, because if we can find it here, or even if we find a Cavalier of Thorns that mills one over, we're in a similarly great spot. So I just got to hope the opponent doesn't have too crazy a turn here. They did miss a land drop last turn, and they don't have that much devotion here. But the fact they did miss a land drop last turn does mean that they must have a handful of gas, and we don't know what they've fetched off the Huntmaster yet either, so we'll have to see. Okay, there's Khan. So they can untap, they can go for Liquid Metal Coating on my forest here, which is a bit rough. We still have Nykthos, thankfully, which does give us access to 5 mana though, so Okay, they do attack the Cura. We'll definitely let the damage through because the Llanowar Elves could be very important to... Well, it is very important to giving us more mana off the Nykthos here. So I presume they target the forest here, yeah. Might as well tap it. See what we draw for the turn. Oh, wow. Okay, perfect. So now we can go Nykthos, activate... Oh, it's kind of laggy. I don't know why. Then untap the Nykthos again, and then we could potentially play the other Kiora here. But I think I'm just going to go for Storm and save it. Because we still have 2 mana. If we hit another Nykthos here off a Cavalier or something, then we can... We still have the 2 mana to activate the Nykthos again if we need. Okay, nice. So now we find Karn, which is pretty good, and we have Storm in the graveyard, so I think I'm just going to play Karn here, and because that shuts off the opponent's ability to use the liquid metal coating, and then I want to grab something just, you know, expensive to play for next turn, probably Cityscape Leveler. I'm thinking here that can take out any creature they have, that can guaranteed take out Karn or Cure it as well. So even if the opponent does find a way to attack down the Karn here, we still have a really strong follow-up play. Plus, Cityscape Leveler triggers both Up the Beanstalk and Cura, so it's guaranteed to draw us 2 cards here. So, and now without Liquid Metal Coating being online, they can't deny us the mana off the forest that's producing 3 mana as well. Yeah, opponent just keeps it up, so we managed to get ahead there, yeah. Up the Beanstalk has felt really good in these mirrors so far. Okay, so we're on the play here. And yeah, definitely happy to keep this. Right, we got Halfling into Kiora into Karn, which is a really solid curve out. So opponent considering their mulligan here, but yeah, always keeping this one, especially on the play. And then we'll obviously see what the opponent's on, but a lot of different options that we could pick off Karn. I think fast Karns, you know, if it's the mirror, I think Liquid Metal Coating is probably the pick to go for early on. Even outside of the mirror, if the opponent's playing a slightly slower deck, Coating can still be good there as well. If not, we've got stuff like Sky Sovereign against the creature decks. So, yeah, I'm pretty optimistic about this hand. We are a little bit soft to Thoughtseize, right? If they take Karn, then we do lose our top end here, but we have a lot of good draws, so... Okay, Forest Halfling, so could be the mirror, could be Yawgmoth potentially. Probably more likely the mirror because of the basic forest, but we'll have to see. And if it is the mirror, I'm very happy with this hand, right? We can get Karn down and then potentially get Coating online as well. I mean, it depends what they play. If they play a big creature here, then we might have to play a little bit more defensively, but... Okay, definitely the mirror match here then. So they sprawl. Okay, nothing else is really good to see. Interesting. So we draw the Voracious Hydra. So... I think I'm going to wait on the Karn a turn here, because if we wait a turn, we can go for Karn and Coating in the same turn, which seems a lot better than just going, you know, Karn and not doing anything this turn. I'm going to use the Cure untap here to make Voracious Hydra a 3/4 so that we can attack down an opposing Karn if they play it, right? If they play Karn and minus here, we can cleanly attack it down with the Hydra, even if we want to use the Halfling mana to get Coating. Plus, you know, Cura, the minus is worth using at this point, and, you know, having a 3/4 body is just better than having a 2/3, right? Might as well use the minus to make it slightly bigger. Wow, very slow start from the opponent. They must just have a lot of top end here, I'd imagine, then. But yeah, either way, very happy to see that. It means we can just go Karn, grab Coating, and just cut off their mana, which I imagine should just be good enough to win, right? Then we can just... you know, get something big off Karn next turn. So I might as well just use the Cure untap. We're definitely on the offensive here, so might as well, you know, use the Karn untapped. Use the Cure untap to get through an extra point of damage. So now we're Coating their forest to stop them activating it. It means they've only got access to 3 mana here at most. Oh wow. And we draw a Demolisher, so I'm just going to go after their lands here. Yeah, okay, opponent just scoops it up. So that's a bit unfortunate. They obviously kept a top heavy hand and we had a fast Karn start, but happens in the mirror match sometimes. You know, this is the reason why I quite like builds that are good in the mirror match, because if you're just both playing you know, a generic devotion deck, the mirror match often just comes down to who has the fastest start. And in that game, I obviously just got off to the fastest start and was on the play as well. So while devotion is popular, I think builds teched for the mirror are a pretty good choice. You know, assuming you're not losing massive points in other matchups in order to do so. So we'll see how fast the opponent's start is here. This isn't as good because we don't have a Demolisher. We do have quite a fast Khan though. Oh wow, now we do have a Demolisher. Okay, sick. So now we can go Utopia Sprawl on green. Hopefully the opponent doesn't have a crazy turn here. Okay, Polukranos, that's not ideal, but not the worst either. So definitely want to get the Paradise Druid into play here, just so we have something to mutate onto next turn. Also, you know, if they are running Voracious Hydra, it has hexproof, so it can't get hit by any interaction they might have, which is obviously great. Okay, attack with the Polukranos. See if they've got a follow-up play here. Maybe a Khan or something. Okay, Old Growth Trolls. They do have a decent number of creatures in play, so giving them a 3/3 hit does mean that we're probably going to have to play kind of slowly to stop them attacking us, but again, we don't really have to worry about interaction because it has hexproof, so unfortunately we can't go Beanstalk into Sawtusk Demolisher, or we can do that, but it'll tap the Paradise Druid, which would then mean that we're under an enormous amount of pressure. I think we need to keep the 6/6 back to block here just to slow them down. So now they're back down to 2 mana. They do have a lot of stuff in play, but cutting Devotion off mana is the best way to win, unless they just have a handful of lands, in which case they could potentially recover, but interesting. Okay, so we got Hollowhenge Wrangler, so we could lead on Beanstalk, and if we find a land, then we can play the Wrangler and draw a card. If we don't find a land, I think we're probably forced to just play the Hydra X=1, which isn't ideal, as just a blocker. But I do think it's worth getting the Beanstalk in play here, because then we can, you know, go for Wrangler next turn. We could have also potentially gone for Khan, but to force them to attack. But since we are kind of choking them on mana a bit, I really don't, I don't want to kill the Old Growth Troll and give them extra mana that way, if that makes sense. But yeah, we're developing to the board a lot faster than they are now. And Devotion doesn't run that many lands either, so when you cut them off 2 mana sources, it becomes very difficult for them to recover. Okay, so they go for a Halfling, and we miss a land again, which is kind of rough. I think we want to, again, I think we're kind of priced into just trying to deny mana wherever possible. And the nice thing here is that we can go for Voracious Hydra X=3 to draw a card off the Beanstalk. Wow, don't hit a land again, which is a little bit annoying, but we can take out the Delighted Halfling, which again keeps them on 3 mana, so, stops their most powerful plays. And again, we're not applying pressure, but we just have so much more access to mana, so that should hopefully allow us to develop more, which is typically how you win these mirror matches. Okay, opponent has had a lot of lands. Okay, Cure is a great draw here. It's basically free because of the 2 Utopia Sprawls. And now we can go Wrangler, which draws us a card off both the Beanstalk and the Cure as well. And we also seek a land, so we could potentially find a Nykthos here, which would be huge. Okay, we don't find a Nykthos, but we do find the land guaranteed off the Wrangler, which is nice. Actually, I guess we could have played Wrangler earlier in order to guarantee the land, but I felt like I wanted to get Beanstalk in online, and I also wanted to use the Hydra to kill the Halfling. And now, even if they do find another land, which they do, we're so far ahead on board here, and we have Cure online that I think we should just be good. Slowing down the opponent's ability to ramp. I don't know what they could have in hand, though, for them. Maybe they just got a bunch of Storm the Festivals. Not 100% sure, but got a lot of options here. I think I'm going to lead on Khan, and then, again, we've got a ton of stuff that we could get off the Khan here. We could potentially get Coating. We got 1, 2, 3... Oh yeah, opponent just scoops that up. I mean, we did slow down their ability to develop a lot off that early Sawtusk.